Good evening. The timing on this is almost polite. The world is bracing for another round of trade shocks. Everyone's talking about tariffs again. Everyone or just you know who? Anyway, in the middle of all of that, India and Europe say they are close to signing a trade deal, a very large one at that. They're of course calling it the mother of all trade deals, which already of course tells us how the sentiment in the room was when that phrase was approved. Nearly 2 billion people, close to a quarter of global GDP. So when a deal like that is that big, it gives us a lens to look at trade relationships. Who's trading with whom? Who's deeply tied together? And who's still waiting on the sidelines? And that's actually what makes this very, very interesting. This FTA has been in the works since 2007. It stalled in 2013, then was reinitiated in 2022. And finally now, the negotiations are entering the decisive phase. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says, "We are on the cusp," end quote. She's flying down to India next week, the India-EU Summit, which is on the 27th of January. And you know what? One always has a sense that when the top brass flies in, usually the deal is already finalized in the back offices. So in 2024-25, India-EU goods trade hit roughly $136.5 billion, out of which India exported $75.85 billion, India imported $60.68 billion worth, clearly making the EU India's largest goods trading partner. Europe wants reliable partners because global trade is getting messier. So then what does India want? We want what the basic understanding is: market access and supply chain positioning, and that too very urgently. Jobs are a priority for India. Our country wants lower EU tariffs on labor-heavy exports, textiles, garments, leather, the industries that employ millions of people. From India's side, the asks are fairly straightforward. Easier approvals for pharma and chemicals with lesser friction and faster access to export markets. It is of course a good thought because at a time when global trade is getting messier, that acts as insurance. Europe's wish list, on the other hand, is to sell more cars, which means the automobile sector is in the spotlight, along with wider access for industrial machinery and electrical equipment. And they, of course, want stronger intellectual property protections as part of the package. The deal even says cheers to wines and spirits, flowing seamlessly into the agreement. But of course, we'll keep that aspect of the policy very policy only on this channel. But of course, do let us know if you want us to cover this as a very special report with all the details. As we have mentioned, that India plus the EU equals a market of nearly 2 billion people, which is 25% of the world's GDP. This actually goes further than a contract, and it starts to nudge supply chains, standards, and investments in a whole new direction. That said, some caution is still warranted. If this deal was always such a natural fit, you know what? It should not have taken 18 years to reach this point. The hurdles faced were political: market access against domestic protection, IP rules against affordable medicine, which are, I guess, the usual fault lines in a deal of this size. But you know what is the biggest stumbling block, and what it has been, which is CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is the EU's way of putting a carbon price on imports. For heavy exporters, it functions like a green wall, especially when manufacturing isn't low carbon as yet. And of course, let us not forget, what has also pushed this into a decisive phase is how much India has changed in the meantime. Its growth, its scale, and its role in global supply chains. So yes, the deal is close to signing, but until the ink is dry, this still remains a negotiation. At Davos, French President Emmanuel Macron warned that we are actually shifting towards a world without rules, end quote. A world where trade is weaponized, where tariffs replace treaties, where power decides outcomes, and even the optics lined up. Macron addressed Davos in reflective aviators. Officially, it was a minor eye issue. Unofficially, it felt like more like a posture, a leader bracing for glare. Because the world right now is harder, more transactional, less forgiving of hesitation. In that environment, this FTA looks like a choice of who you can actually trust and who needs to stand next to you. For Europe, India is that bet. And at this point, it's not really about the tariffs. It's actually about staying steady while everything else is shifting so dynamically. And of course, Davos wouldn't be complete without Donald Trump blowing his trumpet. He's speaking today, 7 to 7:45 Indian Standard Time. Punctual, thankfully. On the sidelines, of course, is India's biggest business names. Tata, Bharti, Infosys, Wipro. All are expected to meet with him with polite smiles and, of course, very measured conversations. When seen together, this emerges, that the India-EU FTA is arriving just as trust is being repriced globally. Europe is looking for stability, India is looking for scale, and both are trying to finalize things before the next tariff tweet reminds everyone how fragile certainty really is. And of course, in conclusion, here is the front page take. Davos this week is like a World Cup knockout stage. We don't watch every match, but we definitely want to know who's going to be making the finals. And that's what we are tracking on front page. The India-EU deal, the Trump session, the CEO conversations happening on the sides. Because together, they point to where jobs, capital, and exports are moving next. And more importantly, what that means for India's next growth cycle. Of course, if you've missed our earlier coverage, it's all there. And please, do tell us, what are you enjoying watching out of all of that? This, ladies and gentlemen, is Front Page by AIM Network. Always remember, think AI, think AIM.